Greetings comic lovers and welcome back to Casually Comics, the channel where we chat all things comics, from reviews of comics new and old to history to anecdotes, really wherever our whims take us. Super Sons, the comic wherein Jon Kent, son of Lois Lane and Superman, and Damian Wayne, son of Batman and Talia al Ghul, team up and have adventures. The two first met in the pages of Peter J. Tomasi's Superman book, and were so in love that they got their own book. At the time of this recording, with DC verbally placing an emphasis on having a looser canon and the coming of the Omniverse, even though we could go into a lot about how this was kind of already in play, they've always dabbled in having series taking place outside of the main minutia, but still from a certain point within canon. But we will leave that for another time, for the celebration at hand is that there will be more Super Sons with the same writer. This was after their adventures were rudely interrupted by Jon Kent being hyper-aged. But the idea of the Super Sons did not start with them. Nay, the concept of Batman and Superman having sons who went off on adventures together is old, Silver Age old, and you know you want to hear about it. I posted a pic in my community tab and you all marveled at Batman/Bruce Jr.'s pants. So we're gonna take a look at the history of the first set of Super Sons, and the surprising amount of attempts DC made to make their existence make sense canonically, by either erasing them or bringing them back. But before we get started, I'm Sasha, and if you're enjoying this content, you know what to do. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Join us on this comic book journey. The Super Sons were an idea that floated around for a while before they came to the fore as a fully realized concept. This was in World's Finest Comics, later just changed to World's Finest, a series that ran from 1941 to 1986, and while it features covers of Batman, Robin, and Superman teaming up, the first issue where they actually did was issue 71 in 1954. As for the Super Sons, they are given two entry points into the series. The snarky teen or college versions can be traced back to issue 215, and were created by Bob Haney and Dick Dillon. But if you want to get technical, this wasn't their first appearance. Not of the Super Sons together, or even of Batman Jr. specifically. Batman Jr. was a concept that had appeared in Batman 131, 145, and 163. Now, Batman Jr. and Superman Jr. would appear for the first time in World's Finest in issue 154. This was in 1965, and it was written by Edmund Hamilton, with art by Kurt Swan and Sheldon Moldoff, and it was under the editorial eye of Mort Weisinger. And look at this cover, here they are, as toddlers. And later as young children, and they very much have identifiable mothers, because one of the things you'll hear about the Super Sons run is, oh, no one knows who their mothers are. That's for the later version. For this first one, we have scenes of the two getting married. Clark has married Lois, and Bruce has married Kathy, the first Batwoman. Both women are well aware of their husbands' identities, and it's 1965, so they both loudly proclaim how happy they are to have given up crime fighting in Kathy's case, and her career in Lois's, to be wives and eventually moms. This one is really interesting because the subheader could be Batman is a better husband and father. The plot is largely driven forward by how Clark's son, Kal-El Jr., is bullying Bruce, and how they need to sort it out themselves because their parents and their friendships are falling apart over it. They also set out to prove themselves and fight their first villain. It's hokey but cute, and spawned a sequel issue very quickly in World's Finest 157, the one with the great title Abominable Brats. Here they're much older and they appear to be rebelling, and Bruce Jr. is even out looking for kicks, and we know how that ends. Look what happened to Larry Luthor. Became a space pirate. Bruce is going to join his crew. These versions of the characters are slightly tweaked by the next creative team, though for some reason Haney and Dillon are often the ones who are given full credit for the idea. So what are the differences between these two versions of the Super Sons? Well, this time around, Superman's son is called Clark Jr., not Kal-El Jr. Bruce kept his role as Batman a secret from his son. Neither were trained to be little mini-me's of their fathers, and they resent it. And now their moms are suddenly mysteries and don't have their faces shown for reasons. As mentioned, the first appearance of this version of the characters was in issue 215, and this was in 1973. These Super Sons are children of the Bronze Age, not the Silver Age. And so what had been a more lighthearted and silly exercise in the imaginary story variety, this one would be played more seriously and also seemingly be taking place within canon, whereas the other Super Sons have been situated outside of it. These sons would have angst and have to deal with teen issues. They would have chips on their shoulders at the start, and they would also use the hippest slang constantly. They were out looking for jive and to get their grooves on. Their slang was a little late, even for the time. This usually happens because by the time that slang makes it into a work, it's usually on its way out. You're trapped. Slang is a trap. If you use it, you have to know that you're going to sound dated and just embrace it, accept it, like I do. Their first appearance just keeps on giving. Bruce Jr.'s pants, the fact that they look so similar they could be brothers, which just adds to the idea that Clark and Bruce are their dads. Superbat shippers unite and take flight. I mean, World's Finest has some famous issues from that point. Tentacle aliens, anyone? It also looks like Bruce Jr. is saying they'll ruin their own lives lives, which after reading their adventures is 100% straight facts. These versions of the characters would appear 12 times, including their final appearance in 263. That was in 1980. Here their existence would be retconned by writer and editor Denny O'Neil, who was not fond of them, did not want them around, and because they were technically part of canon, had to explain where they went. I mean, he technically didn't have to, they could have just faded, but people would have asked. In fact, the comics had been ignoring their existence for a little while. The last appearance before the final one was in issue 242, and that was all the way back in 1976. But something had to be done, and so we were given an explanation. Oh, what a glorious explanation it is. They never existed. They were a computer simulation that Clark was running on the computer in the Fortress of Solitude. Because you know, it was super important that he know what would happen if him and Bruce had kids at the same time. Sometimes I wish we had real sons instead of the computer mock-ups. I mean, no, I don't need to say anything. We're all people of culture here. You all know. But the concept of Batman and Superman having sons, specifically biological sons, because I mean, Batman did have Robin, his ward, who was sidelined hard for a bit after these versions of the Super Sons appeared in this comic, well, it was an idea that was still being floated around. The concept would be revisited in the Elseworlds series Superman and Batman Generations, an Elseworlds story that would play with everything in the DC universe happening in one timeline, and our heroes being replaced by their progeny. In this case, Joel Kent and Bruce Wayne Jr. His nickname this time is BJ. Not mature enough for that. In this world, Supes is married to Lois and Bruce is married to someone. This was an experiment as to what the universe would look like if everything was placed within an identifiable time frame. And it was framed around real-world events. Does any of this sound familiar? 5G, Generation 5? They've toyed with this idea for a while. It doesn't work, let it go. These Super Sons were a different set, so they are assigned to a different Earth, as are the ones before them. All the multiverse for all these different Super Sons. The Generations outing was by John Byrne and began in 1999. That same year, Bob Haney, who was fond of his version of the Super Sons, had them appear again in Elseworlds' 80-page giant. This book was described as, heroes are taken from their usual settings and put into strange times and places, some that have existed and others that can't, couldn't, or shouldn't exist. This was one of many stories in the issue, and actually there is one story that, even though it would eventually be up for Eisner's, was removed because it was deemed to be too inappropriate. It was not the Superman Jr. story. Now this story caused some to question, hey, how does this work with all of the crisis and all of the infinite Earths and they're, you know, not existing anymore? So it was explained that this version of the Super Sons existed in hypertime, a place in space that hadn't been affected by crisis. I don't know, personally I was willing to accept there were loose ends that hadn't properly been wrapped up by crisis, but DC has always liked trying to dot its I's and cross its T's when it comes to continuity. Even at the time of this recording with the aforementioned omniverse and fluid continuity. This omniverse and fluidity is just going to be a place to try and give those loose ends a place to live, and also to revisit ideas that were kind of messed up because of changes made in canon that now can't be undone. You know, without having to reboot the entire universe again, and also to revisit any time period necessary. Even after all these Elseworlds, the idea of the Super Sons persisted. Shenanigans happened with the Earth 154 variants. That's the original Super Toddlers versions, appearing so briefly during Infinite Crisis, because everybody appeared during that. It was an event about restoring the multiverse after all. But that got seemingly crushed by Flashpoint. The New 52 also gave us a version of the Super Sons. They would be Chris Kent and Damian Wayne from Earth 16, members of the Just, the spawn of the classic JLA, who don't actually have to fight crime because their world is a utopia, so they're more like celebrities. Which then leads us to Rebirth. When these characters did have children, each from a unique set of circumstances within their own storylines, Damian came into play far before Jon. There was an opportunity seen when DC Rebirth occurred to bring them back together, bring back this more fun concept. Because at their core, the Super Sons were a fun idea. The execution hadn't always been the greatest, but there was something there, and it could be seen again when Jon and Damian came together, and it seemed to really coalesce into something that readers could accept fully. Not all of them, of course. Two characters, the sons of Batman and Superman respectively, but different from them. Even just them being Robin and Superboy was a huge step up from them being Superman Jr. and Batman Jr. The comic finds a balance between the kids having their own adventures and their fathers figuring out how to parent them. But it doesn't feel like they're in their parents' shadows. It feels like you should be focusing on them, and it's fun to do so. There's enough lore around them by themselves that they can hold their own. Their first outings began in 2017, and their comic became a fan favorite, which was why the backlash was so intense when Jon was hyper-aged to being significantly older than Damian. It's only a couple of years, but it matters at that time, because it created a huge shift in their dynamic. And few fans could follow the rationale as to why he had been aged up. It didn't seem to be making him have better stories. Poor Damian. Jon got aged up, Dick got shot in the head by the KG Beast and became Rick, his dad was off doing yoga on the beach. It's no wonder he snapped and tried to kill the KG Beast. And lest we forget, There are a series of graphic novels featuring the Damian and Jon Kent versions of the characters, except Damian goes by Ian and has brown hair, so does Bruce. It's such a little thing, but it's super off-putting. The first of those, Super Sons: The Polar Shield Project, came out in 2019, part 1 of 3. It's arguably one of the better graphic novels, if for nothing else than the fact that it's one of the closest to the source material. Some of them veer very far off. It's definitely one of the most transferable, meaning if you read it and you're interested in the Super Sons, you could then jump into the comics in the main verse without having too much confusion. Here's a synopsis. Jon Kent and Damian Wayne are opposite in every way except one. They are the sons of the world's greatest heroes. To uncover a global conspiracy, this unlikely dynamic duo will need to learn to trust each other and work together to save the Earth. So that is the saga of the Super Sons, a simple concept with many versions, and they all have a little something different to offer. The cover to issue 216 from the Bronze Age run is probably my fave. Have you seen our missing sons? Way to look super hard, Clark. We all know you don't want him back. Were you aware of the multiple versions of the Super Sons? Do you enjoy the Damian and Jon Kent comic? Will you be seeking out a pair of Bruce Jr.'s pants? Answer all that and more down below and share some of your favorite concepts that originated in the past of comics and keep popping up. I want to hear all about it, and I also want you to do all the YouTube things. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell notification so that you never miss a vid. Thanks so much for taking some time out of your day to spend it discussing comics with me. I always appreciate it, and I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.